We talked about vascular plants yesterday. We talked about seed plants, okay? One type that we talked about was the gymnosperm. Today we are going to talk about angiosperm. Now, if you remember that yesterday we said that a gymnosperm was a naked seed, okay? A gymnosperm was a naked seed. Now, that meant that it was not enclosed in an ovary. So, what we're going to see about the angiosperms is they will have ovaries, okay? Angiosperms are typically called flowering plants, okay? Flowering plants. And you might think, a tree, okay, is a tree a flowering plant? Well, it depends on what type of a tree it is. If it's a conifer, a pine tree like we just talked about, no. Okay, but can other trees have flowers? Well, what about an apple tree? Okay, an apple tree does actually have flowers because you're going to see that an apple tree is one of these angiosperms. Okay, so dealing with these angiosperms, we're going to deal with parts of a flower because that is the main thing of these flowering plants. So, on our parts of a flower, the very first thing is the sepals. Those are these things right here. The outer leaf-like part of the flower that encloses the developing bud for protection. Okay? At my house, I love roses. So I have roses planted in my whole side flower bed. Now, think about a rose when it's in a bud and just starting to pop out of that bud. Okay? That is what this sepal is. Okay? The part that protects the flowers, the enclosed bud. The stem. Okay? The stem. If multiple flowers connect to one stem, it is called a pedicel or a flower stalk. The stem will help to support the flower. So you're probably one time or another going to see this again, this pedicel. So understand that that is the stem or the flower stalk. Petals. Probably the thing that we are most familiar with of a flower. Petals. This is the colorful structure on the flower which attracts the pollinators. Okay? It is actually the landing pad. Okay? It's the landing pad that the pollinators fly in on, and as you're going to see, when they fly in on these, they are going to help pollinate the flower. Okay? They're going to help pollinate the flower because inside of these flowers, okay, inside these petals are the reproductive organs, both the male and the female. Okay? Remember, we talked about perfect and imperfect, right? What was an imperfect flower? It had what? It did not have both the male and the female. The perfect had both male and the female. Imperfect did not. Okay? So as we're going to see, enclosed in these flowers, in these petals somewhere, it's going to be the male and the female reproductive organs. The receptacle. Okay? We said that this is the sepals, right? Here's the sepal. Down here's the sepal. Up here's the sepal. Right here, this part is the receptacle. the end of the flower stalk to which all of the flower parts are attached. The end of the flower stalk to which all of the flower parts are attached. Now we're going to get into the female parts of the flower. I just have a picture here. It's a cross section of a flower. It has both the male parts and the female parts on it. We're going to start off talking about the female parts. So, the female parts together, all of the female parts together are what we call the pistil. Okay? And when we talk about the pistil, we're going to talk about three parts. The top one, the first one, being the stigma. The stigma is part of the female reproductive organ. It is the top, and it is sticky. Why is it sticky? Because that is where the pollen attaches to. You're going to see that the pollen, or we've talked about it, the pollen is the male gamete, all right? So the pollen sticks to the stigma. That is how the whole pollination occurs. Now stop and think about it. We got a little bumblebee. It flies in, it sees these petals that look really, really good to it. So it flies in and it lands on those petals. When it lands in the petals, it collects pollen. It bumps into some, and we're going to see the male parts later, it bumps into the anther, which collects pollen. As it collects pollen, it has pollen on its body. It flies to another flower, lands on that flower, and bumps into the stigma. When it bumps into that stigma, that sticky part of the stigma gets the pollen off of the bee. And then all of a sudden, that bee has now been a pollinator. It has taken the pollen from one flower to another flower. And we're going to have the reproductive parts starting to occur. Okay? So the stigma is that sticky part of the female reproductive organ that accepts the pollen. Right here is a picture of the stigma. Here's another one, a little cartoon picture, but it's just the very top part of the flower. The next part we're going to talk about is the style. The style is this long part right here. Okay? So here is from the top the style. And the style is the long tube that connects the stigma to the ovary. What happens is when the pollen goes onto the stigma, the pollen starts making what we call a pollen tube. So the pollen tube grows all the way down this style, okay, all the way down, and eventually the ovary down here has ovules in it, which we'll see on our next slide. But this ovary down here has ovules. Eventually, those pollen tubes will grow all the way down to the style, all the way down the style to the ovary, and it will actually fertilize the ovules in the ovaries. Okay, here is the next part of the flower that we were just talking about. The ovaries, okay? The ovaries have ovules in them. So the ovaries contain and protect the ovules, which become fertilized by the pollen. The ovules will develop into seeds, which the ovary protects when it becomes the fruit. So, what happens? After fertilization occurs, the ovules develop into seeds. The ovary then will develop into a fruit, and it surrounds the seeds. So, let's talk about the apple tree. We've all ate an apple, right? You take an apple, you cut it in half, there's a core, and in that core it has seeds, right? So, the seeds are the ovule part. I look up here on the diagram, see these little circles here? Those are the ovules. This whole thing is the ovary. Here are the ovules, okay? Once fertilization occurs, the ovules develop into the seeds, okay? And this ovary develops into the fruit. So, at one time, that apple that we are eating originally started out as being the ovary of that flower. And apple trees actually are flowering. Have you ever seen a flowering apple tree? Okay. I have. Pay attention. When you go out somewhere and see apple trees, there are flowers on them. You might not think so, but there are. So, as I'm looking at this is a little bit better picture, even though it says male parts of the flower, okay? Right here, okay, here is the stigma up top. The style is the long tube. And finally, down here is the ovary. And you can see the little ovules inside the ovary of the flower right here. Now, just a point, because if you look up here, it says stigma, style, ovary, and it labels them the carpel. Okay? I told you that we're going to call it the pistil. Other folks have referred to it as the carpel. So if you hear the term carpel, okay, if you hear the term carpel, it's referring to the same thing that we're talking about as being the pistil. But as far as your test goes, you're going to use the pistil, not the carpel. Okay? Now, the male parts of the flower, okay? The male parts of the flower we call the stamen. The stamen consists of two parts. The first one is the anther. The anthers are made of 4 pollen sacs which produce pollen grains via meiosis. So the anther makes pollen grains by the process of meiosis. We've talked about meiosis at the beginning of this semester. Okay? Pollen grains are made by meiosis. When the pollen grains are mature, the anther splits open and releases the grains to be carried. They can be carried by wind, they can be carried by water, they can be carried by a pollinator. We talked about the bees. Okay, I just saw the other day, I was sitting at my mom's house yesterday talking to my mom and dad, they had a hummingbird. Okay, could a hummingbird be a pollinator? Absolutely. Okay, because he's going flying around from different tree to tree, flower to flower to flower, okay, to get some nectar. Now, if you look at this, here's a picture. Here's a more common one that I like to see, because right here is the anther, this red part. That red part is the anther, which is going to end up producing all of the pollen grains via meiosis, okay? Now, if you've got allergies like Nate and I do, okay, you know that the pollen's pretty high now, isn't it? Okay? The spring is a big time where these trees are starting to get into their reproductive mode. So, the pollen is more in the spring and the summer. You think there's a lot of pollen out there in the winter? Do you have a lot of trouble with your allergies in the winter? Probably not. I don't have too much trouble with allergies in the winter. I don't have too much trouble with them in the summer now that I started getting allergy shots. But definitely, the warmer, the spring, the summer is where we're going to see more of this pollen floating around. That pollen causes our allergies. All right? So this anther right here, we just talked about. Now, this right here, the green part here, is what we call the filament. The filament is the thin stalk that supports the anther. So once again, here's just another flower blowing up. You see the stalks, okay? You see the stalks? Those stalks are the filaments, and these little yellowish, orangish things right here on the tops of the stalks are the anther. And if I would cut open the pollen sacs of this anther, you could see that here are the pollen grains that are starting to be produced. Okay? So that is the male part that we call the stamen. So we have the stamen, we have the pistil, the male, the female. All right? Now, okay, when I'm looking at this, okay, let me go back a couple of slides, okay? That's but if you look at this slide right here, okay? You look at this picture here, right here is the female. We have, right here is the pistil, because we have the ovary with the ovules, we have the style, we have the stigma. Now, right beside those are the stamen, because here's an anther, here's a filament. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4 stamens surrounding this one pistil. Okay? There can be multiple stamens around a single pistil. Can a flower have more than one pistil? Absolutely. Okay? It's not very common, but they can. Okay? So, could this flower pollinate itself? Could there be pollen right here from this anther that sticks on to the stigma right here? What do you think? Well, sure it would. Yeah, it's called self-pollination. This flower can pollinate itself. Okay? So this flower could pollinate itself. And that happens a lot because flying in there, do you think that this bee could hit this anther and then fly by the stigma and put the pollen from the anther onto the stigma? Yeah. Could the wind also do that? Yeah. Could it happen when it was raining? Yeah. Huh? Well, it's not, yeah, no, nothing like that because, right, it's just, yeah, plants don't have incest or, they do self-pollinate is what we call it, okay? Now,